take a quick look, well, a little more extensive look at some of the short answer questions that you're going to be asked to answer on the parties, interests groups, and members of Congress for this upcoming quest. I'm going to provide you some guidance as to what resources to use. Obviously, you can use open resources on this. I'm going to provide you some guidance as to what resources you may where to go, how to frame this up. One question of which we didn't really go through extensively in class. You're going to need to extensively in class. You're really going to need to pay attention to this, and maybe stop the video at certain points in time. Some might provide a little more detail than others to help you. So I'm going to hide my fat face here, so it's a little easier to see the screen. So starting with the question on considering what you've learned about the two major political parties, does the two-party system help or harm democracy? Keep in mind what the two-party system does. And remember, going back to your 5.1 notes that you had, some of the chapter notes that you had, keep in mind some of the things that the political party does. Nominates candidates. It keeps, so unifying large groups of people with shared ideas and common goals. So these are some of the major, benefits, if you will, of political parties and what political parties have historically done. The electoral system, single member districts, discourage voting, and there's no consensus for a rival party. So these the parties make for a little bit more of a consensus. So again, the idea is that they're these are the things that political parties do, and what are some of their functions as you go along. What do they do? So that they inform and activate supporters, and they have a platform, so to speak, so that you can tell where the candidates stand on major issues. There might be, without this two-party, without the nominating process where they nominate candidates and set political parties apart from other political groups, there could be lots of candidates for every election, and it could be very difficult to select a candidate. So again, large groups of people with shared ideas and common goals through this idea of having what we would call the major idea here is that they might unify groups of people, and narrow down the number of candidates, right? Narrow down the candidates through the use of a platform to have a common set of ideas. Okay. Again, a lot of these 5.1, your guided reading will help you to look at that. They choose to try to bond them together, and choose qualified candidates. They might act as a watchdog, and they want to inform and activate supporters, so bringing them together. So parties have these functions, and so it does make things a little easier for the voters. However, it can divide people, right? Who have ideas that differ. So minority opinions can be silenced, giving them this system gives little or no chance to third party candidates because they don't have the support of the party machine, right? They don't have the support of the major party machine. So this is a drawback. So in general, what you're going to do is you're going to decide based on the information, come up with based on the criteria, a clear position and evidence to support that position. You could say they both harm and help democracy. You could say it just helps democracy. You could say it harms it. but a clear position with evidence from what you've learned from resources to figure out to make a position. Again, a paragraph will suffice. But I was just kind of helping you sift through information. So the 5.1 notes will really help you there. The other one to consider is what influences a member of Congress when they vote. What influences a member of Congress when they vote? So this is the one you're really going to need to pay attention to a little bit more, because this is the one that I this is the one that I want to really hammer with you, because I didn't necessarily talk about it extensively. We talked about 10.4. We talked about the 5 different roles of Congress members, but one of them is to be a representative. But what type of representative are they going to be is the question. So how do they vote as a representative of the people? Do they vote strictly as when they vote on legislation we're talking about? Do they vote strictly as delegates and see themselves as agents of the people who elected them? So in other words, what do the folks back home think? Do they see themselves as trustees? And with each question of law decided on the merits of law, no matter what people, regardless of what people think. That's another way to consider being a representative. Partisan, again, this is where your first allegiance is to your party or your platform. Special interests, of course, play a major role here, but the influence of special interests in political action committee money to raise money for the party, to raise money for your reelection. And then politicos is basically the idea that you're trying to balance all of these factors, being a trustee of the people, a partisan, where you're having an allegiance to your party, but also a delegate. What do the folks back home think? This, I will tell you, and this is where I need to get my pointer out. This is where a large number of the politicians would like to think that they fall into politicos. So whose views of Congress, whose views should members of Congress represent with voting? Now, your opinion is, does this work to be just politicos, or should they solely be looking at seeing themselves as delegates? Because, and consider, the special interests and how the special interests end up could be tainting things, and you could argue that the people don't have enough authority here. So you can look at this. You may make a case for all of the ways that they can vote as a representative, or you may make a case for just some of the ways that they can vote as one of the ways that they can vote as a representative. It doesn't have to be. It can be all of them. It can be some of them. So think about how they're voting and take these into consideration as a representative of the people, and think about how they should be voting and considering legislation. So you can make that argument, break these down, the pros and cons to each of these based on what we've learned. Is an allegiance to a party solely good, and then that ignores other people? Again, and you have to also understand being a trustee could be valuable too, because legislation can be rather complex. Legislation can be a rather complex affair that people, the average person, doesn't understand. You get legislation that's yay thick, some of it written by special interests. So you have to consider that as well. So again, a position, and then support for that position. Okay, clear support in a paragraph. Number 3, do you believe interest groups help or hinder the democratic process? Remember that when we did the group notes, we talked a lot about benefits and drawbacks to interest groups, and how they can give a voice to people who otherwise might not be heard, educate government officials and the public about issues, represent groups of people with common concerns, and provide a way for people to get involved with public affairs. And kind of an informal part of the checks and balance system. However, they can use their money for purposes of corruption. So remember, this was part of your 9.1 group notes that we were looking at and that you were supposed to have gotten. So look at some of the major drawbacks. So like here are some of the functions that they fulfill. So you can look at these and talk about providing detailed information to government, additional checks and balances to the political process, stimulate an interest in public affairs, um, and giving a voice to people who otherwise might not be heard, is another way. But then they can also pose problems, right? Because they can become too powerful and really not um, be overly representative of disproportionately representative of their interests based on the general population. The national NRA would be an example of that. They may not represent the views of the people for which they claim to speak. Um, they, their name might imply that they have thousands of members, but they might just be for a few people with the narrow interests. So their power can be much greater than the actual people that they represent, and they can also overlap with political parties, and and again, so they can become too powerful and undermine the political system with briberies and threats, and really kind of run things. I'll give you an example. The political process for the nomination of Supreme Court justices and federal judges in general has been ran by a group called the Federalist Society, a conservative think tank group that's really ran the direction of appointing a lot of judges. During Trump's term and with the Republican Senate, and it's been very heavily criticized because is this running the Federalist Society? And allowing all these judges to come in, are they really in the best interest of the people? So again, interest groups can give voice to people who might otherwise not be heard, though, and educate government officials and public affairs about issues. So that they do serve that. They educate, help stimulate interest, and you could say an interest, and educate. Educate people in public affairs. But and they can act as a checks and balance, and they can provide um, a way for people to get involved, vehicles for political participation, a way for people to get involved in the political process through an interest group. They do serve some good, because you need groups sometimes. One individual, the power of groups is sometimes better than the power of individuals to have your voice heard by Congress. So those are some of the ways that it can be broken down. So if you look at some of these, as you're answering this question, how they can pose problems, but how they can fulfill many functions, these are the things to look at as you're um, answering this particular question. Do you believe interest groups help or hinder the democratic process? You could even argue that it's both help and hinder. You certainly can take that position that it can be both help and hinder the democratic process. It doesn't have to be an all or one. You just need to be able to support it with work from your notes on the text. Okay. The other thing to consider is the gerrymandering argument analysis. Now, this is going to be a couple paragraphs based on what I've attached here, to a bunch of articles. So you're going to need to look through these and provide some context here for what's for arguments. So summarize what the arguments for and against gerrymandering are. Okay, summarize what the arguments for and against gerrymandering are, and then what is the effect of Michigan voters passing Proposal 2 in November of 2018? What is the job of the Independent Redistricting Commission? So gerrymandering does have pros and cons, according to that article. It's been discouraging. There's some arguments that against gerrymandering because it discourages people from voting because the party in control is most likely going to win. Think about that. It could make districts uncompetitive. On the other hand, it also does make some of the districts competitive, and even they can justify the shape of those oddly shaped districts that you were looking at by explaining, how depending on the population. So the boundary lines are drawn proportionally. They have to be about the same number of population. And sometimes gerrymandering isn't bad. If you look at some of these articles, some of the articles that in here make it the case that gerrymandering might not be horrible. Like, for example, in this article from the Politico, it doesn't always make it safe for incumbents. And I will use an example of this. Um, MI, and if this would ever come up, MI8 and MI11, I told you, were designed as Republican districts. However, and these are the districts right below us in Michigan. However, if you look at MI8 and MI11, they're clearly gerrymandered. They're long districts stretching all the way from Lansing to all the way from Lansing into Oakland County and Macomb. That's crazy, and even crosses in from MI11. But then MI11 is also goes all the way down Livonia and then wraps around Pontiac. It's a very strange district, and then MI14 does one of these where it's trying to capture a lot of Democrats. So these were designed as Republican strongholds, but in both cases they're ran by Democrats. So the Democrats won. So it can backfire on people and sometimes give an upstart an advantage as well. So gerrymandering may not always be favorable to the party in charge. But again, you need to look at this and evaluate this. And the other thing it's asking you to do is, what's the job of the Independent Redistricting Commission that's going to start taking effect here after the next census? And I will give you a little clue here is that with the Independent Redistricting Commission that was passed by Michigan Proposal 2, it's basically an anti-gerrymandering act. There's going to be 13 Michigan representatives, 4 Dems, 4 Republicans, and 5 who aren't siding with either party. And they're going to meet after the census and determine districts. And people will be choosing at random. In fact, they've already been chosen. And really, the Secretary of State's going to oversee this. And they're supposedly supposed to provide a recommendation, and the state house has to, the state legislature has to adopt the recommendation for these districts. So it'll be interesting to see, at least from my perspective, how it's going to change and maybe make it more fair. But remember, everything has to be proportional. So all these districts represent the same number of people, even though they're oddly shaped. Okay, all these districts represent that. So again, the idea here is that you're going to write an analysis piece of what the arguments for and against gerrymandering are using those articles that are attached to the assignment. And then what is the effect of Michigan passing Proposal 2, the job of the Redistricting Commission, and one benefit and one drawback to the redistricting. So there will probably be less corruption, but it could also be there could also be political fights as well, considering the fact that there's 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats. So it may not always be the Redistricting Commission can have its own internal struggles. So again, reading about Proposal 2 there will really help you as well to figure this. To decide on this, we're looking at Proposal 2 here, and this, which has already been passed by a initiative of the Michigan voters, will help you with this as well. And this gives a good breakdown of it, and how it looks. So Ballotpedia would help you with that, but also there's some other articles that give some pros and cons as well. An overview of it, and what Proposal 2 looks like. So you need to take a look at these articles, and then write a couple paragraphs of evaluating the arguments using the prompts. So that's really the one where you're going to need to do a little quote unquote outside research. Otherwise, you can just use your notes as expected. Make sure that these paragraphs are double spaced so they're easier to read. Obviously, you can use your notes and resources for this, as assigned. So hopefully this provided some guidance for you. I know you had to listen, perhaps take notes, but provided you some incentive and some guidance to help you structure these.